Moral judgment in the mental health profession. Typically, when mental health professionals make value judgment, they will be worried about having imposed their own values on the clients. And indeed, moral judgment is not encouraged in the mental health profession. And I want to investigate why it is the case and how is it that it's right to make moral judgment. To do that, I have to identify the right moral judgment to be made in a mental health setting. And for me to do that, I have to investigate how is it that this professional code came about. So first of all, the mental health profession is an institute. It has its social role and it has a certain legally defined duty. Therefore, when it makes diagnosis, they have to follow a manual. They have to have something as a whole profession to do a certain thing in a standardized way. And let me take antisocial personality disorder as an example. It describes the disorder with the following descriptions, and you have to satisfy a few, maybe one or three, or and one of them is about failure to conform to social norms with respect to lawful behaviors, and repeatedly performing acts that are grounds for arrest. So this identifies antisocial behavior with legality, with what is ground for arrest and what is illegal. But then there are other descriptions that uses terms like being consistently irresponsible and lacking remorse. For example, when you talk about someone lacking remorse, you presupposes some morality, because it is with immorality that someone did some wrong, and it's with not knowing, understanding, having the insight or acting on the insight of that wrong that someone demonstrated their lack of remorse. So to identify someone with a lack of remorse, you have presupposed some morality. So that's value laden in a way that's morality laden. So it's not completely morality neutral, even with the DSM-5. But to think about value neutrality, we can go back to political philosophy on its discussion of liberal neutrality. And John Rawls, his notion of comprehensive doctrine, it's about people's way of life, or whatever that informs their conception of the good, that makes a difference to how they lead the life freely. So that's the comprehensive doctrine, and usually it includes religion, because in a pluralistic society there are people with different religion, and different religion would have informed different conception of the good. And a liberal society ought to have a social structure with presupposition that's common ground among all comprehensive doctrines. That's the overlapping consensus. But then this raises the question of what exactly is a comprehensive doctrine? Is that only about religion? Is all religious value thus belonging to a comprehensive doctrine in a way that's never to be included in the overlapping consensus? How about the metaphysics of persons? There are some religion that has some presupposition about what persons are, but that doesn't make that presupposition false. But with that in view, we can see that if mental health professionals like counselors are free to impose their value on their clients, they could have preached on the sly and abused their power because they are in a position of power. They have the authority over the client. And if they were to slip in religious value, the client might not have known. So that's one way I would understand the discouragement of making moral judgment in the mental health profession. But then when we think about philosophy, we have Immanuel Kant with his formula of humanity, which states that humanity obligates respect, treating others as an end in itself. We can see that the goodwill with its intrinsic value, we could have an imperfected goodwill, not being a perfect person, but that's different from acting on disrespect on others. Because when you treat others as an end in itself, it's different from when you treat someone as a mere means and even to do what the other person does not want to be done to. That's when you act on disrespect, and you do that out of ill will, evil. And the DSM-5 typically identify antisociality only with illegality, with a little bit of value-laden descriptions, but then there is a fact of the matter whether someone is moral or immoral, and that's when it's clearly disrespectful. So with morality, we can see that there's a fact of the matter whether someone is moral or immoral, and this will be important later on. So with that in view, I want to look at mental health and propose an immorality conception of mental health, of mental illness, and an immorality conception. So immorality, because morality, humanity, obligate respect. So in order to be a person with a goodwill, you have to be respectful, even though you might not have perfected your humanity. It's different from when you are a disrespectful agent. So that's when you fail as a person. So that's failure of personhood. That immorality, I want to understand a kind of mental unhealth with immorality. So let's consider mental disorder. Hallucination, it's a positive symptom of schizophrenia. It's a biological malfunction. Maybe the brain, they have some neurological problem, maybe that the too much neuronal activity, and hallucination, drugs, psychiatric drugs will alleviate the problem. So that's a disorder, right? But that's different from an illness that's of the person. It's a personal malfunction that constitutes psychopathy. Psychopaths, when they experience, well, others suffering, when they saw others being tortured, they understand that that's someone suffering, but they feel not with the victim, but they feel with the perpetrator. They enjoy others suffering, and that's on disrespect instead of being what a person ought to have been. So that's a personal malfunction, and that kind of psychopathy distinguishes a kind of disorder that's biological from below. So I want to understand mental health and mental unhealth with immorality. So let's go back to value latentness, because we can look at religion, because it seems that when we talk about comprehensive doctrine, we want to do something that's not presupposing any religion, But let's look at religion. So in Buddhism, there's the noble truths, the four noble truths, and roughly they state that craving causes suffering with tanha, dukkha, and we should not be attached to the world without a craving for things earthly, so we can avoid suffering. And in Christianity, Christians and Jesus also talk about not being attached to your earthly possession in Mark and in Luke and in various other places of the Bible. On the other hand, capitalistic maximization of profit, it's typical of a society that runs on capitalism, that you maximizes your profit. And when you do that, because you have to sell your good and how much asset you have, how much capital you have, it will become a comparison and you need others' approval to buy goods from you. And you have to look good in front of other people. So these are kind of things that's earthly, whether you're attached to earthly possession like money or earthly possession like fame, others' approval. Religion, at least, there are these two religions that advise not to assign too much value, advise us not to be attached to these things. And of course, it has its secular application. Even if some religion recommended that, it doesn't mean it's only religious to follow those advice. So if you understood those to be good advice, then the following is a secular application. So Roy Baumeister, he understood self-esteem, especially low self-esteem with unfulfilled need for self-worth. So self-worth is roughly about how much one is worth, how much one thinks oneself to be worth in the psychological literature, a little bit like subjective self-worth. So it's an unfulfilled need for self-worth that brought about low self-esteem. And of course, in a capitalistic society, we compare how much asset we have, we compare the number in our bank account, and we would feel inferior when we have less money than others. That's when your self-worth is built on the money you have and in comparison with others. But if you restore respect for yourself, you don't crave, you don't slave for others' approval, but you determine your own value. If you know what's good for you, what's right for you, if your conception of the good is something that you will own up instead of just want to get famous, instead of just want others caring, then you don't slave for others' attention. And that would be something that divorces your self-worth from what other people think. And that's one way to apply the religious advice to our everyday life without presupposing any religion. Given this background, I hope that I can contribute to the education of the mental health professional in terms of the following. So Aaron Beck, the famous psychologist who initiated the cognitive behavioral therapy, he believes that there are cognitive distortion that makes us think wrong and depressed. But if we cognitively reinterpret some experience, it would help. But there are cases in which, like, well, when you bet on margin and lost a lot of money and you're depressed, should you reinterpret your experience or should you just not continue to bet on that? What exactly do you want when you do that? And if all you wanted is to get more money than others instead of having some meaningful, significant work in your life to make money out of works that are intrinsically good, that are your own achievement, if you distinguish self-disrespectful want and point out to the client that that's wrong. You should not want that. And thereby the depression you experience, you're not to reinterpret to feel better about losing money. You just ought not have pursued that path. And to know that sometimes your low self-esteem, it comes from a personal failure, and you should learn to be more self-respectful instead of seeking others' approval. So that's one way that mental health professionals are permitted or even obligated to point out something that makes a moral difference about what the clients want ought to have been. And of course, to relate that to antisocial personality disorder, Eric Fromm, a psychotherapist, he theorized incompetence, impotence. That's the word he uses. And its relation to compensatory violence, because some are not competent and they need to feel themselves competent, and they do that by dominating others through violence, and the violence they commit is to compensate for their lack of competence or even for their inhumanity. And that's when it's clearly immoral that someone pursue their life goal. And when we look back at the antisocial personality disorder, we will have some more ingredient when we make diagnosis. So I have talked about how moral judgment could have been a problem because it could lead to abuse of power by counselors who are figures of authority in front of the client. But then I identify when it is right to make moral judgment and make advice about how mental health professionals are to discern when it is right to tell the clients that they are doing something wrong and wanting something wrong, so they will know that their depression comes from their immoral or even irrational want.